Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me today and also for your efforts in highlighting the human rights in Saudi Arabia to be always discussed in the international and national platforms. As we have all seen in the video, it appears that to what extent the Saudi regime is going all the way to change and whitewash the typical image about the country and the government, especially in the recent 7 years. As you all know, I will only speak about the academic halls and what is known as culture, especially the Western culture. Why in the Western regions? Because the Saudi regime, although it's trying to head towards Asia, as happened recently in the meeting with the Chinese president and also founding intimate relationships with India and Russia. However, there is a very important dilemma the Saudi regime suffers from, which is the security of the regime is connected closely to the Western states, headed by the United States of America and Europe, including France, Germany, and other countries, which guarantee the safety of the regime. I'm not saying the safety of the country, but the regime and the royal crown. This was actually clear in the recent 7 months with the increasing on the deterioration of the war between Russia and Ukraine and how the European countries depend to a very big extent on the petroleum of Saudi Arabia. It appears that the West, which tried to create a certain space between the Saudi regime, especially the USA, has failed to a very big extent in doing that after it became subdued to the Saudi pressures through the energy resources. That's why the Saudi regime is trying to whitewash its reputation, especially in the West. It's within a strategy to protect the throne, because in the West, there was a lot of confusion, a lot of questioning on the seriousness of the relationship of Saudi Arabia and USA, especially after the assassination of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Turkey in 2018. So the Saudi government, headed by Mohammed bin Salman, were highly focusing in having two attempts to change or modify the cultural speech, because it's highly important. The cultural speech is a lot of governments actually depend on that, especially the governments in the West, because they are trying to read, to have opinions and perspectives on what is being issued from Saudi Arabia, all of that by academics, in order to follow up all the developments happening in the kingdom. And based upon that, they are trying to build up the future policies. So all from the beginning, there are three main axes for the prior phase, which actually happened far away, but continued also the reign of Mohammed bin Salman, first trying to impact the lobbies which are in USA and London and Washington, D.C., London, and other capitals around the world. So think tanks or the research centers which actually address directly the decision makers in Washington and London and other cities. These centers address or use their speech by the business community, the businessmen, the petroleum companies, energy resources companies, all the companies which have really interests or investments in Saudi Arabia. They want to know to what extent this regime is solid and their investments are safe in that country. So among these centers, many of them are actually receiving support amounts of money directly by the Saudi regime. And based upon that, there is an attempt to produce a total new speech which would make the decision makers in the Europe or the Western governments, to make them feel comfortable that this regime is open and it's heading towards the liberalism, and to take down anything that may tackle the personal rights and would allow the community to express themselves in entertainment, tourism, the singing festivals, dancing in the streets. So these researchers in such centers are doing respective visits to the kingdom, and they are meeting and interviewing with persons who are related directly to the regime. They are telling them about the changes that are being done, and they would go back to their centers and writing reports saying that this community or this society, we should congratulate them for this very epic transfer change, because they have changed the old pattern related to extremism, to terrorism, to the Wahhabis call. All of this has been changed. They are trying to whitewash this from the historical memory of the West, that this community have actually made a whole turnover and became a total new community all through these reports, articles, and books being published. Of course, they are being published through being funding such centers, because one funding comes from some government. Of course, that this will affect or impact the academic speech or addressing. So the other thing is the university platforms. Since the petroleum issue happened, there is an excess support funding to these universities, which are founding research centers. This will change from one country to another, from the USA to another country. In the USA and in the UK, they are allowing all the foreign funding to come to fund or support research centers in these universities. First of all, most of the universities are private universities. In the UK, the universities are neither private nor public. They are in between. These two, they are receiving funding and support from the local government, but they can also receive funding from offshore. And most of the European countries like Germany, France, Italy, most of these universities are public entities in which the funding usually is received from the state itself. That's why there's a confirmation from not receiving any foreign funding in such universities. However, there are some manipulative ways which Saudi Arabia can use to bring this funding to them, either through funding a research center. Let me tell you one example. In the university that I teach at, London School of Economics, we have a very big hall, Bin Zayed Hall, and it was funded by the United Arab Emirates. I remember in 2011, there were consecutive meetings and lectures in this hall speaking about democracy in the Arab world and the Arab Spring. This hall is under the name, this is probably a joke because about this name, because it's related to a place where they claim that we can speak about democracy totally freely. So funding just came in this way to give such posts in academic posts like Cambridge University in the UK. There is a special academic post, professor for Arab studies or Islamic studies. So all of these money have one goal. However, the universities would just confirm to their audiences and to their people, despite that they have foreign funding and foreign governments like Saudi Arabia. However, they are conserving the non-biased approach. However, there are attempts, but the real problem that the money is always related to attitudes, and this funding would actually stop if a contra attitude would happen, contra to what the donor wants. Also, there is another dilemma with the media, which is a part of the cultural aspect. As I recall, in 2017, when Mohammed bin Salman was really highlighted in the media, journalists from around the world, especially from American newspapers like Washington Post, New York Times, and all the journalists, famous ones, they were very interested in following the Middle East, and they went to Saudi Arabia and wrote articles which may shock who follow them, because they would say that there's actually a revolution, there's a radical change, and Saudi Arabia would be a normal country without any violations. All of these writings and articles were or happened in the period when the regime tried to prove that it has changed to the better. This is a past period, but now we have the second phase, which is the social media period and the academic involvement who are related to the Saudi regime in whitewashing the regime image through using the social media or through using the tweets, especially. For example, as in the tourism sector, we have the influencers, or what they call are known as influencers. They are brought up to taking photos in some very important touristic sites in the country. And most of them are women from Australia, from European countries, and they would pay them big amounts of money just as a touristic visit, with taking photos of them in very special regions for the tourism aims. The same attitude is being used by the academics who are in Saudi Arabia. So as monitoring Twitter and other social media platforms, I find that some academics, they have been really away from the academic researchers. They were just wandering around the country and taking photos. I will not mention any names, but this is very clear. In an attempt to whitewash the country and the regime and the so-claimed change, and all of this would tackle the sensations or the emotions of the investors or the decision makers in the West, who want they want them to believe that the country has actually changed and there is a better future under the reign of this regime. And all of these attempts are to change the reputation, the image, especially since 2018. The event which happened in 2018 was disastrous as for Saudi Arabia and its reputation worldwide. That's why there was a very frank desire to use the public relation companies, as well as exploring the academic spaces, which are usually outside the PR or the image reputation improvements. However, the regime wants to go slowly and softly to mingle in the Western civil community, because they are well aware that the public opinion in the West has changed and has been against the kingdom, especially in the last 7 to 8 years. There are many events which have turned the opinion of the West against Saudi Arabia, especially the imprisonment of the women, which was very important for the global civil society. especially before the UN agencies, the human rights organizations, and the Western parliaments. All of this focus has actually affected the reputation of Saudi Arabia. There was a very frank desire to affect the new generation students who actually receive their education through professors who have direct relationships with Saudi Arabia, either through their writings, their articles, their teaching, to change the public opinion worldwide. I believe that this attempt is going on until today. And I don't know to what extent it has been successful, because we can't really monitor or document this, and to what extent it can impact the decisions of the governments, the businessmen. Are they actually being hesitant or going to visit the country just because they read some article which is actually complementing, as happened in the last 6 past years, especially the businessmen in which they are actually having increasing amounts of investments to Saudi Arabia. In 2018, a lot of known persons and banks and commercial centers and commercial posts, they have never been to Saudi Arabia at the last moment. So we shouldn't lose hope here. The efforts that you are doing as a human rights organization and other similar organizations do impact in having an equilibrium in the public opinion. So it won't be totally subdued to the Saudi whitewashing, either through think tanks or the Saudi lobby and the Western capitals or the universities or the media channels, or even the academic influencers who are exploiting their posts as academics to publish such a humanitarian image about the country. Their first concern is to make the Saudi regime to be humane. Like other normal countries, there are touristic sites, people living just in normal life, but without highlighting any kind of suffering of the prisoners or detainees, executions which are going on in the country, because this would be a black point in the series of the narrations, the new narrations, which the regime is trying to prove.